I'll show you the markets and what the oil and US dollar is looking like in just a moment. First, Stats South Africa will today release the economic growth figures for the second quarter of 2022. Now, the economy grew by almost 2% back in Q1, and the Bloomberg Media Survey suggesting it's likely, though, to have shrunk by 0.7% in the second quarter. Let's unpack this, joined by a well-known economist, Isaah Mhlanga, this morning. Isaah, good morning. Good to have you with us. So up 1.9 in Q1. We're down about 0.7 in Q2. We're still off the back of a positive from the beginning of the year. So it's not a complete loss, is it?
Look, it's not a complete loss, but I think if we just consider the events that took place in the second quarter of the year, it makes sense to expect a contraction in the economy. We had floods in KZN, which disrupted all the logistical corridors between Durban and Joburg. But we also had, load shedding, one of the most extremes we have seen, which would have meant that sectors that depend to a large extent on electricity, such as manufacturing and mining, would have contracted. And if we just look at high-frequency data, they show that manufacturing and mining contracted by 5.5% and 3.3% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. We also look at retail sales volumes. They are down roughly about 0.9% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. Wholesale sales volumes also likely declined by 5.6% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. So those are quite significant sectors of the economy. But where we have a lot of uncertainty is on the financial services, where we do not have high-frequency data to give us a sense. But if you contrast that with the unemployment numbers that came up, that improved marginally, it seems to be there might be a dislocation, which might be as a result of the survey, difficulties that Stats SA had in the previous quarters, which is starting to normalize.
I see government concern, they say, about how load shedding is affecting the GDP as well. Is there any kind of indicators that you're seeing, Isaah, that could lead us to attribute a drop in GDP directly to the blackouts, directly to load shedding?
Absolutely. But I think what we also need to be quite mindful of is the economy has already recovered to pre-pandemic levels. In the first quarter already, that positive number you mentioned in your opening was big enough to push the economy 14 billion rand above where it was just before the pandemic. Even this contraction is not going to take the economy back to pandemic levels. So we are still in a positive territory relative to where we come from over the last 2 years, but the contraction itself is not something that we should welcome, given that we still have a lot of social issues that need job creation. And for that to happen, we need to see the fixed investment components of the GDP continue to improve, which by any indication are starting to show some signs of improvements, but not nearly fast enough.
It's not as well, and obviously we don't live in a bubble here in South Africa. A lot of the markets that we deal with on the international front also taking a hell of a smashing, especially considering what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine, our drop against the US dollar as well. So let's just get a sense then of Q2 numbers expected out today. I'm hearing between 0.5%, 0.9% on the down as well, but Q3 is also not looking all that good. If you as an economist had your crystal ball, Isaah, it looks like the bad news is not going to end for our GDP.
Indeed, we forecast Q2 numbers to be about minus 1.2%, which is a little bit worse than consensus expectations. But Q3 numbers are showing as if they're likely to turn back into positive territory. No matter how small it is, it's likely to be positive. Because if we look at high-frequency data, it's improving. Which gives us a sense that we might have improved out of the flood and load shedding infested quarter two, such that overall for the year as a whole, we still expect growth to be between 2 and 2.5% for this year. But next year becomes quite difficult to forecast, given that we have Europe that is going into a winter of discontent and a recession already. The US also tinkering with the recession, given the central bank's interest rate hikes in that particular country, that is going to weigh on domestic demand. And the third one, which is China, a big trading bloc with South Africa accounting for a third of our trade, also seeing significant moderation with the property bubble. So globally, it's not looking pretty. And South Africa has always been lifted by what happens globally.
Well, just the last question to you then. I suppose there's at least some positive out of this. I'm sure you heard me talk about it a moment ago, the fuel prices coming down. I know we're tracking slightly away from the GDP, but as far as the economy is concerned, Brent crude holding south of $100 per barrel the last couple of weeks. So that's at least some good news, I'm sure, from an economist perspective, that at least the oil price is down so we can save some money on fuel. Were you surprised by the drop that we're expecting in the fuel price?
Not surprised at all. Oil price decline, if the currency does not weaken, it translates directly into a reduction in fuel prices. And that also plays into Q3 GDP, because when people are not spending as much on fuel, they will spend on other things, which means consumption from household is also going to be boosted going into quarter three. Only if we see this trend continuing for the rest of the quarter.
Well, we'll take a look at what the markets look like in just a moment. Isaah Mhlanga, thank you very much, an economist joining us here on eNCA. So we know the JSE ending flat yesterday, some 67,400 points. This is off the back of losing those early gains out to industrial stock markets as well. We heard Isaah talking about that oil price as well, as long as that is holding steady against a steady US dollar as well. That is why, as of midnight tonight, we're going to see a fuel price increase. So oil running south of $100, and the US dollar versus South Africa at the moment, we are into 17. But let's bring you the very latest.